The Forgotten Promise. Marcus Rivera had seen enough broken worlds to know that beauty and devastation often occupied the same space. But nothing in his 20 years of humanitarian work had prepared him for Zenera Prime. The planet hung in the viewport of the diplomatic shuttle like a jewel carved from pure light, its surface shimmering with structures that seemed to grow rather than be built. Spires of crystalline material stretched toward the stars, connected by bridges that phased in and out of visibility, following some rhythm Marcus couldn't begin to understand. The pilot, a cheerful young ensign named Chin, glanced back at him with barely concealed amusement. "First time seeing a Zenari world, Mr. Rivera?" Marcus managed a nod, his mouth too dry for words. He'd worked in places where the sky rained acid, where the ground was more rubble than earth, where entire cities had been reduced to memories and dust. But this was different. This was beauty so profound it felt almost aggressive, demanding acknowledgement. "Wait until we get closer," Chin said. "The capital city is something else entirely. They say the Zenari don't build structures so much as convince matter to arrange itself more artistically." "That's poetic," Marcus replied, finding his voice. "Also completely unhelpful for understanding what I'm looking at." Chin laughed. "Yeah, that's pretty much the standard human response. Just wait until you try to navigate the palace. I got lost for 3 hours last time, and I'm pretty sure I ended up in a room that didn't exist when I walked in." Marcus pulled out the message cylinder for perhaps the 100th time since it had arrived at his cramped apartment on Station Meridian. The object itself was a work of art, formed from some material that felt like glass but gave slightly under pressure, warm to the touch despite having no obvious heat source. Zenari script flowed across its surface in patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The translation chip embedded in his neural port had rendered the message in standard English, but the formality of the language had done nothing to explain the actual content. "Marcus Rivera, former combat medic and current director of the Frontier Relief Network, your presence is requested by Her Radiance, Queen Seraphine of the Zenari Empire, for a matter of personal significance to the Crown. Transportation has been arranged. Your immediate attendance would be appreciated." Appreciated. As if refusing a summons from an alien queen was actually an option. His supervisor at the Relief Network, a perpetually caffeinated woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, had practically vibrated with excitement when he'd shown her the message. "Do you know what this could mean for our funding? The Zenari Empire controls 17 systems, Marcus. 17. If they decide to support our operations, we could actually afford medical supplies that aren't 50 years old and questionably sterile." Marcus had pointed out that the message said nothing about funding, but Yuki had already been composing grant proposals in her head, her eyes distant with bureaucratic dreams. The shuttle banked hard and Marcus's stomach performed gymnastics. Through the viewport, the capital city of Zenera Prime resolved into focus, and Marcus understood why Chin had looked so amused. Calling it a city seemed inadequate. It looked like someone had taught music to become solid, all flowing lines and impossible angles. Buildings spiraled upward in defiance of structural engineering principles Marcus had thought were universal. Gardens floated between structures, actual floating gardens with trees whose leaves caught the light of Zenara's twin suns and scattered it in rainbow patterns. "The Zenari mastered gravitational manipulation about 800 years ago," Chin offered, clearly familiar with the stunned silence that tended to follow first views of the capital. "Changed everything about their architecture. Also made them insufferably smug at engineering conferences, but don't quote me on that." Despite his nerves, Marcus grinned. "Your secret's safe with me." The shuttle descended toward what could only be the royal palace. It dominated the city's heart, rising from an island of gardens that themselves floated above a lake that reflected the sky with such perfection that Marcus briefly couldn't tell which direction was up. The palace looked like frozen music, all curves and crystalline surfaces that caught light and transformed it into something more than illumination. They landed on a platform that hummed with barely perceptible energy. When the shuttle door opened, Marcus stepped out into air that smelled clean in a way that Earth's atmosphere hadn't for centuries, with an underlying scent like ozone and night-blooming flowers. Two figures waited at the platform's edge, and Marcus recognized palace guards despite their armor looking like liquid starlight frozen mid-flow. They were tall, these Zenari, topping Marcus by at least a foot. Their skin held a faint luminescence, pale like moonlight on water, and their features were sharp and elegant in a way that made human faces seem blunt by comparison. But it was their eyes that caught Marcus's attention, large and expressive, colored in shades that had no human equivalent, something between violet and silver. "Marcus Rivera, the guard on the left said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested Zenari vocal anatomy operated on different principles than human. Her radiance awaits your presence. Please follow. Marcus fell into step behind them, trying not to feel like he was stomping through a crystal shop. The palace interior was even more overwhelming than the exterior. Corridors seemed to shift as he walked, walls displaying what might have been windows onto other locations or artistic representations or possibly actual portals to places that didn't technically exist in normal space. Other palace staff passed them, all moving with fluid grace that made Marcus acutely aware of his own clumsy human gait. Quick question, Marcus ventured as they climbed a staircase that spiraled through what appeared to be a garden growing sideways. Is there protocol I should know? Special greeting? Particular way to address royalty? I'd rather not accidentally commit treason through ignorance. The guards exchanged glances. Be respectful, the right one said. Speak honestly. Her radiance values truth above formality. That was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Marcus had dealt with warlords, corrupt politicians, and corporate executives who'd considered basic human decency a negotiable expense. But alien royalty was a new category entirely. The corridor opened into an antechamber that made everything previous look modest. The walls weren't walls but contained space, actual space, with nebulae slowly rotating in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The floor was transparent, revealing gardens far below, though Marcus suspected the spatial relationship was more complicated than simple below. At the far end, massive doors stretched upward, carved with patterns that seemed to tell stories in a visual language Marcus couldn't read. The guard stopped before them. When you enter, approach the throne directly, the left guard instructed. Wait to be acknowledged. The court will be present, but her radiance has requested to speak with you personally. Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the doors swung open. Not gradually but all at once, with a resonance that Marcus felt in his bones. The throne room beyond was impossible. There was no other word for it. Walls curved in ways that shouldn't connect, the ceiling either very high or not there at all, and stars rotated through the walls like the antechamber but larger, more immediate, as if the room occupied space between worlds. And there, on a throne carved from luminescent crystal that seemed to contain entire galaxies, sat Queen Seraphine. Marcus's brain, which had been working overtime processing architectural impossibilities, ground to a complete halt. She was rising, which protocol probably didn't call for, her gown flowing like liquid starlight given form. Her face held that characteristic Zenari beauty, all sharp elegant lines and luminescent skin, hair like spun silver falling past her shoulders. But it was her eyes that stopped him, large and expressive, colored in shades of violet and silver that widened as they locked onto him with an intensity that felt physical. The assembled court, dozens of Zenari nobles in elaborate attire, fell silent. Marcus realized he'd stopped walking and forced his feet to move, crossing what felt like a vast distance while dozens of eyes watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Leave us. Seraphine's voice carried across the chamber, and it wasn't a request. It was a command that brooked no argument. All of you. The court erupted in whispered protests. Advisors stepped forward with obvious concern, but the queen raised one hand and the room fell silent. She repeated her command and this time the assembly moved. Marcus stood frozen as the throne room emptied around him, courtiers filing out with backward glances, guards taking positions outside the massive doors. The silence after the doors sealed was profound. Seraphine descended from her throne, each step deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. She stopped perhaps 5 feet away, close enough that Marcus could see her hands trembling at her sides, close enough that the formal distance of monarch and subject collapsed into something far more personal. She reached up with shaking hands and removed her crown, this object of impossible beauty and incalculable worth. She set it aside on a pedestal that appeared to materialize specifically to catch it. Without the crown, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and somehow more real. Human, she whispered, and her voice cracked on the word, all regal composure fracturing. Do you still remember what you did for me? Marcus's mind became a cascade of faces, thousands of them, cycling through memory at increasing speed. 20 years of humanitarian work across 40 different crisis zones. How many people had he helped? How many lives had he touched in passing, people whose names he'd never learned, whose faces had blurred together in the endless stream of suffering and survival? Your radiance, he began, falling back on formality because it was the only anchor he had. I've worked relief coordination and medical aid for 2 decades across more war zones than I care to count. I've helped a lot of people, but I'm not certain. Dust Haven, she said, and the name hit him like a physical blow. 12 years ago. The mining colony during the Frontier Wars. Dust Haven. The name alone brought back sensory memories so vivid that Marcus could smell the recycled air thick with mineral dust, could hear the constant background noise of distant artillery, could feel the red grit that got into everything and made everyone cough blood-tinged phlegm for weeks. He'd spent 6 months there, the worst 6 months of his career, embedded with the 47th Medical Corps during the height of the Frontier Wars. I remember Dust Haven, Marcus said slowly. I remember a lot about Dust Haven. Most of it involves improvised surgery in collapsed buildings and arguing with supply officers about morphine rations. Something flickered across Sarathin's face. Memory. Both. She moved past him, pacing toward the walls where stars rotated in their impossible dance. Her hands clasped behind her back, fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles showed stark against her luminescent skin. I was not a queen then, she said softly. I was a soldier. A fool soldier who believed in honor and glory and all the pretty lies our commanders told us about the righteousness of war. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The Frontier Wars had been a brutal, pointless conflict over mining rights and territorial claims, a mess of corporate interests and political posturing that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The Zenari Empire had officially been neutral, but rumors had always circulated about Zenari mercenaries fighting for the highest bidder. My unit was hired by the Cashin Corporation, Sarathin continued, her voice barely above a whisper. We were told it would be simple security work, protecting mining installations from raiders. They didn't tell us we'd be participating in attacks on civilian settlements. They didn't tell us the raiders were often just desperate refugees trying to survive. She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw tears shimmering in those alien eyes. I was young. I was stupid. I followed orders until the day my unit was ordered to clear a civilian shelter. We were told they were hiding insurgents. I looked through the targeting scope and saw children, Marcus. Human children huddled with their parents, terrified. Marcus remembered those days. Remembered the constant stream of casualties from clearance operations, the way his hands had shaken when he tried to save children who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I refused the order, Sarathin said. My commanding officer executed 2 of my squad mates as an example, then ordered the attack anyway. I fought him. I killed him, Marcus. I killed my own commander and tried to warn the shelter, but I was too late. The building collapsed under orbital bombardment. I pulled 3 humans from the rubble before the structure came down on top of me. The memory hit Marcus with crystal clarity. He'd been working a triage station when the collapse happened, had been elbow deep in someone's abdominal cavity trying to stop arterial bleeding when the call came in. Survivor trapped in the rubble. Possible hostile. Proceed with caution. He'd gone anyway because that's what medics did. They went toward the screaming while everyone else ran away. You were trapped under a support beam, Marcus said, the memory sharpening. Pinned across your lower body. Your armor was cracked, and you were bleeding from wounds I didn't even recognize because Zenari anatomy wasn't in my medical database. Sarathin nodded, tears now flowing freely. I was certain I would die there. I was a mercenary who'd turned on her own unit, trapped in enemy territory. When I heard footsteps, I thought it was my former squad mates coming to finish what the collapse had started. Marcus remembered the moment he'd cleared the debris enough to see her face. She'd been covered in dust, her armor shattered, her silver hair matted with blood that shimmered with colors that human blood didn't have. But her eyes had been aware, terrified, expecting death. You were conscious, Marcus said. In terrible pain but conscious. You tried to warn me away, kept saying something in Zenari that my translator couldn't parse. I think you were telling me to run. I was telling you I was a mercenary, Sarathin said. That helping me would mark you as a traitor. That you should leave me and save yourself. Marcus felt a laugh bubble up, inappropriate and slightly hysterical. Yeah, that's not really how the Hippocratic Oath works. It doesn't have a clause about checking political affiliation before rendering aid. He'd spent 3 days in that collapsed building with her. 3 days while fighting raged outside, while his unit assumed he was dead or captured. He'd used every piece of medical knowledge he had to keep her alive, improvising solutions because Zenari physiology was different enough from human that standard treatments didn't always work. You shared your rations with me, Sarathin said. You had barely enough for yourself and you shared. You told me stories about Earth, about your family, about why you became a medic. You kept me talking when I wanted to give up, kept me fighting to survive. You told me about Zenera, Marcus countered. About the gardens that floated and the music that could be seen. I thought you were hallucinating from blood loss and pain medication. I was lucid enough to make you a promise, Seraphine said, moving closer. Do you remember? Marcus did. On the third day, when the bombardment had finally stopped and extraction teams were moving through the rubble, he'd gotten her stabilized enough for transport. But there had been a problem. His unit would arrest her as an enemy combatant. Her former squad would execute her as a traitor. There was nowhere safe to send her. So Marcus had done something spectacularly illegal. He'd tagged her as a civilian casualty, falsified her medical records to list her as human with unusual genetic markers, and smuggled her onto a humanitarian medical transport heading for neutral space. He'd given her his spare clothes, what little money he had, and coordinates to a refugee processing station that didn't ask too many questions. Before the transport lifted off, she gripped his hand with surprising strength and said something in formal Zenari that his translator had rendered as, I swear on my blood and honor, I will remember this. I will remember you. And one day I will repay this debt. Marcus had told her there was no debt. He told her to just survive, to find a way to live a life that meant something, to make the universe slightly less terrible if she could. Then the transport had lifted off, and he'd never expected to see her again. You saved my life, Seraphine said, now close enough that he could see the way the palace's ambient light reflected in her tears. But more than that, you showed me what true honor looked like. Not following orders blindly. Not pursuing glory at any cost. But choosing to help someone who couldn't help themselves, even when it cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything, Marcus protested. I got court-martialed, sure, and dishonorably discharged. But I survived. I found new work. I've been fine. You lost your military career, Seraphine said. You lost your pension, your benefits. You were branded a traitor for helping an enemy combatant. Your own government turned its back on you. Marcus shrugged. I made a choice. I'd make it again. Seraphine reached out and took his hands in hers. Her skin was warm, warmer than human skin, and her hands trembled. I returned to Zenera after I healed. I used what I'd learned, what you taught me about honor and compassion, and I challenged the old order. It took years, Marcus. Years of fighting, years of building alliances, years of proving that strength doesn't mean crushing those weaker than yourself. She gestured to the throne room, to the palace beyond. I became queen not through bloodline but through revolution. I changed our entire society because one human medic chose kindness over convenience. And I've spent the last 5 years searching for you because I needed you to know that what you did mattered. That you mattered. Marcus stared at this woman, this queen, and saw both the dying soldier in the rubble and the sovereign who had transformed an empire. His throat felt tight, his eyes burning. So the whole, do you remember question, he managed, was you being terrified I'd forgotten? That you were just one more face in 2 decades of faces. Yes, Seraphine admitted. Which would have been understandable, even reasonable. But also would have broken something in me I'm not sure I could have repaired. Marcus felt a laugh escape, broken and genuine. Well, your radiance I definitely remember now. This has been extremely memorable. 10 out of 10 for dramatic reveals. Seraphine laughed too, the sound bright and unguarded, and somewhere in the crystalline palace, Marcus felt the future shifting into something he couldn't predict and wasn't entirely sure he was prepared for. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. The debt repaid. The guest quarters Seraphine assigned Marcus occupied an entire wing of the palace, which he felt was approximately 17 times larger than necessary for one person who owned 4 shirts and habitually forgot where he'd left his reading glasses. The bed alone could have housed a small family, and he spent his first night staring at a ceiling that displayed a slow-motion aurora, wondering if his entire understanding of reality had been fundamentally recalibrated in the span of one conversation. His communicator buzzed at what passed for morning on Zenera Prime. The planet operated on a 28-hour cycle that his circadian rhythm found personally offensive. The message was from someone titled, Fourth Assistant to the Royal Scheduler, informing him that her radiance requested his presence at breakfast. Marcus typed back asking if there was a dress code, received a response that was 4 paragraphs long and mentioned the word appropriate 11 times, and decided his least wrinkled shirt would have to suffice. A palace attendant arrived to escort him, a young Zenari woman whose ears were adorned with simple silver rings that chimed softly as she walked. She led him through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves based on destination rather than fixed geography, past gardens that grew in impossible directions, until they reached a chamber that was somehow both intimate and grand. Seraphine sat at a table carved from a single piece of crystal, still wearing the same crown from yesterday but dressed in simpler robes that flowed like water. She smiled when she saw him, genuine and warm, and gestured to the seat across from her. "I hope you slept well," she said as the attendant withdrew, leaving them alone. "I know palace accommodations can be overwhelming for first-time visitors." "I slept in a bed that was bigger than my first apartment," Marcus replied, settling into a chair that adjusted to his body in ways that felt vaguely sentient. It was deeply uncomfortable in a luxurious sort of way. Seraphine laughed, and Marcus realized how different she seemed without the weight of courtly formality. The queen was still there, in her bearing and presence, but the person he'd kept alive in that collapsed building was visible too. Breakfast arrived on floating platforms because apparently even serving food required defying physics. The dishes were unfamiliar but smelled incredible, and Marcus discovered that Zenari cuisine involved a lot of crystallized fruits and something that tasted like honey but had a faint luminescence. "I need to explain something," Seraphine said after they'd eaten in companionable silence for a while. "About why I brought you here beyond simply saying thank you." Marcus set down his fork. "I figured there was more to it than nostalgia. Queens don't usually summon people across 17 star systems just to reminisce. When I returned to Zenera after the wars," Seraphine began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this speech many times, "I was nobody. A disgraced mercenary, a traitor to my former commanders, a soldier who'd lost her way. But I had something that others didn't. I had a vision of what honor could actually mean." She stood and walked to the chamber's edge, where a window showed the floating gardens of the capital. "Our society was built on conquest. For thousands of years, we believed strength meant domination, that power was demonstrated through subjugation. The strong ruled, the weak served, and anyone who challenged that order was eliminated." Marcus heard echoes of human history in her words, the same patterns repeated across species and centuries. "I started speaking," Seraphine continued, "in marketplaces, in public forums, anywhere people would listen. I told them about Dust Haven. About human children dying in collapsed buildings. About a human medic who risked everything to save an enemy soldier because he believed in something more fundamental than allegiance or profit." She turned back to face him. "People called me mad. Called me corrupted by human weakness. But others listened. Others who were tired of endless conflicts, tired of sacrificing their children to corporate wars, tired of an empire built on fear rather than respect." "You started a revolution," Marcus said softly. "I started a conversation," Seraphine corrected. "A conversation about what we wanted to be as a civilization. It took 7 years, Marcus. 7 years of organizing, debating, challenging the old council. There were attempts on my life. People I trusted betrayed me. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the fight seemed impossible." She returned to her seat, her eyes intense. "And every single time I wanted to quit, I remembered you. I remembered a human medic with limited supplies and unlimited compassion, who kept me talking through 3 days of agony, who shared stories about Earth's oceans even though he'd never seen them himself, who believed I was worth saving when I didn't believe it myself." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "I just did what needed to be done." "That's what makes it remarkable," Seraphine said. "You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You didn't do it because it was easy or because someone would praise you. You did it because you believed it was right even when it cost you everything." She reached across the table and took his hand. "That's what I tried to build here. A society where doing the right thing matters more than doing the profitable thing. Where strength means protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. Where honor is measured by compassion, not conquest." "And did it work?" Marcus asked. Seraphine smiled. "Come with me. I want to show you something." They walked through the palace, past chambers filled with advisors and diplomats, past halls where Zenari scholars debated philosophy and science, until they reached a tower that rose higher than any other structure Marcus had seen. At its peak was an observation platform that offered a view of the entire capital and beyond. "Look," Seraphine said, gesturing to the horizon. Marcus looked and saw ships. Thousands of them, moving between Zenera Prime and its moons, between the planet and orbital stations. But these weren't warships. They were transports, medical frigates, vessels marked with symbols Marcus recognized from humanitarian organizations. "After I became queen," Seraphine explained, "the first thing I did was redirect 60% of our military budget to humanitarian aid. We converted warship factories into medical supply manufacturers. We retrained soldiers as emergency responders and disaster relief specialists. We opened our borders to refugees from conflicts we'd once profited from." She pointed to specific ships. "That convoy is carrying medical supplies to the threshold colonies, where a plague has overwhelmed their healthcare system. Those transports are evacuating civilians from the Kestrel belt before the mining corporations can conscript them. That medical frigate is staffed by Zenari doctors who volunteered to work in conflict zones across the frontier. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a weight he hadn't known he was carrying suddenly lifting. You built this. You actually built this. We built this, Seraphine corrected. Your choices taught me what was possible. Your compassion showed me what strength actually looks like. I just scaled it up. Before Marcus could respond, a young Zenari officer approached with urgent steps. Your Radiance, forgive the interruption, but there's a situation developing. The Council requires your immediate attention. Seraphine's expression shifted instantly, all warmth replaced by focused intensity. What's happened? Epsilon Reach, the officer said. The frontier colony. There's been an outbreak. Some kind of hemorrhagic plague. Casualty projections are catastrophic. Marcus felt his body move before his mind caught up, 20 years of crisis response overriding everything else. How many infected? What's the transmission vector? Do they have quarantine facilities? The officer blinked, clearly not expecting a human to start asking tactical questions. Reports are preliminary, but estimates suggest 50,000 infected with numbers rising exponentially. Transmission appears to be airborne. Their medical infrastructure was barely adequate before the outbreak. Now it's completely overwhelmed. We need to respond immediately, Marcus said, his voice taking on the command tone he'd developed in war zones. Every hour we wait, the infection spreads. We need medical ships, containment specialists, enough supplies to establish field hospitals. There's a complication, Seraphine said quietly. Epsilon Reach is in disputed territory. Both the Terran Federation and the Kashan Corporation claim jurisdiction. Neither wants to be seen as yielding authority by allowing the other to lead relief efforts. Marcus stared at her. People are dying and they're arguing about jurisdiction? Welcome to interstellar politics, Seraphine said bitterly. Where saving lives is always secondary to maintaining power. They reconvened in a council chamber where holographic displays showed Epsilon Reach in horrifying detail. The colony was built on a harsh world, barely terraformed, where 30 million humans and aliens lived in pressurized domes and underground habitats. Red indicators marked infected zones, spreading like blood in water. Zenari advisors filled the chamber, along with several human diplomats who'd been summoned via quantum link. Everyone was talking at once, arguing about protocols and permissions, about who had authority to act and who would be blamed if actions went wrong. Marcus watched for 30 seconds before his patience evaporated. Shut up. The chamber fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned to him, most expressing variations of shock that a human civilian had just interrupted a high-level diplomatic conference. I don't care about your jurisdictional disputes, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the chamber with the same intensity that had once made panicking soldiers focus during artillery bombardments. I don't care about your political posturing or your corporate profit margins or your diplomatic protocols. There are 50,000 people dying right now while you argue about paperwork. Mr. Rivera, one of the human diplomats began, his tone condescending, you don't understand the complexities of. I understand that every hour we waste talking, people die, Marcus interrupted. I understand that children are coughing blood into their hands while you debate who gets credit for saving them. I understand that if we don't move now, 50,000 becomes 500,000 becomes 5 million. He turned to Seraphine. You asked me what I would do. Here's what I would do. I would stop asking for permission and start saving lives. I would send every medical ship you have, establish quarantine zones, deploy field hospitals, coordinate with local medical staff. I would do it now, not tomorrow, not after we've negotiated terms. Now. That would be a violation of Terran space, one of the Terran diplomats protested. An unauthorized Zenari military presence in disputed territory could be interpreted as an act of aggression. Then don't send military ships, Marcus shot back. Send humanitarian vessels. Send doctors and nurses and medical supplies. Send help under the banner of the Galactic Health Organization or the Frontier Relief Network or any other organization that both governments officially support. Make it impossible for anyone to object without revealing they care more about politics than lives. Seraphine was staring at him with an expression that was part admiration, part something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. And what about personnel? The GHO doesn't have enough trained responders for an outbreak this size. Then we train them, Marcus said. Zenari doctors volunteer through the GHO. Human medics do the same. We coordinate through neutral channels, share resources, establish joint command structure. We make it about the crisis, not about who's in charge. You're describing the largest joint humanitarian operation in interstellar history, one of the Zenari advisors said. The logistics alone would be a nightmare. Then it's a good thing I've spent 2 decades managing logistics and nightmares, Marcus replied. Give me access to your supply networks, your transport schedules, your medical personnel rosters. Give me 48 hours and I'll have a deployment plan that will save hundreds of thousands of lives. The chamber erupted in debate again, but Seraphine raised her hand and silence fell. She looked at Marcus for a long moment, and he saw the soldier from Dust Haven looking back at him, the person who'd learned that true strength meant choosing compassion over convenience. Council is dismissed, Seraphine announced. Mr. Rivera and I will coordinate the response. Any Zenari personnel who wish to volunteer should report to medical deployment stations immediately. Any objections can be formally submitted to my office, where they will be carefully considered and then ignored. The advisors filed out, most looking scandalized, a few looking relieved. The Terran diplomats protested via quantum link before their connection was terminated. Within minutes, the chamber was empty except for Marcus and Seraphine. That was magnificently diplomatic of you, Seraphine said dryly. I've never been good at diplomacy, Marcus admitted. I'm much better at pointed rudeness in service of not letting people die. Seraphine moved to the holographic displays, expanding them to show detailed colony schematics. Tell me what you need. For the next 6 hours they worked. Marcus coordinated with Zenari logistics officers, mapping supply routes and transport schedules. Seraphine used her authority to cut through bureaucratic obstacles, authorizing the deployment of 12 medical frigates, 300 volunteer doctors and nurses, and enough supplies to establish 50 field hospitals. Messages poured in from other worlds. Human medical organizations offering personnel. Alien species Marcus had never heard of pledging resources. The Galactic Health Organization officially sanctioned the operation, providing legal cover that made it nearly impossible for either the Terran Federation or Kashan Corporation to object without appearing monstrous. 30 hours after the initial report, the first medical ships lifted from Zenera Prime. Marcus stood on the palace landing platform watching them go, ships marked with the symbols of a dozen different humanitarian organizations, carrying doctors and nurses from 20 different species, all united by the simple goal of saving lives. Seraphine stood beside him, her shoulder touching his, both of them exhausted and running on stimulants and determination. When I was trapped under that rubble, Seraphine said softly, I asked you why you were helping me. Do you remember what you said? Marcus did remember. He'd been elbow deep in her wounds, trying to stop bleeding from organs he couldn't even identify, and she'd asked him why he didn't just leave her to die. I said that's not how it works, Marcus replied. I said that when someone's suffering and you can help, you help. Everything else is just excuses. That's what you've built here today, Seraphine said. You took a room full of people making excuses and turned them into people providing help. You did in 6 hours what diplomats couldn't accomplish in 6 months. I just yelled at people until they did the right thing, Marcus protested. That's not exactly revolutionary. Seraphine turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the light of departing ships. That's exactly what I did when I returned to Zenera. I yelled at people until they remembered that compassion wasn't weakness, that helping others wasn't naive, that strength means protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. She took his hands in hers, the gesture now familiar. You asked me if my revolution worked. This is how I know it did. 12 years ago, Zenera would have ignored Epsilon Reach unless there was profit in helping. Today we mobilized 300 volunteers in 30 hours because it was the right thing to do. Marcus felt something in his chest expand, something that might have been pride or hope or both. So what happens now? Now, Seraphine said, we go to Epsilon Reach. You coordinate the medical response from the ground, and I ensure that no government or corporation interferes with saving lives. We work together, human and Zenari, exactly as it should be. You realize this is going to be terrible, Marcus said. Epidemic response in a frontier colony with inadequate infrastructure. We'll be working in hazmat suits in environments that weren't meant for long-term habitation. People will die despite our best efforts. It's going to be exhausting and heartbreaking and frustrating. Soratan smiled. Yes. Just like Dust Haven. Except this time, Marcus said, I'm not alone in a collapsed building with improvised supplies. This time I have an entire empire's resources and a queen who actually understands what matters. And I'm not alone under rubble waiting to die, Seraphine replied. This time I have someone who taught me that one person making the right choice can change everything. The last medical frigate lifted from the platform, its engines leaving trails of light across Zanara's twilight sky. Marcus and Seraphine stood side by side, watching it disappear toward the stars. You know, Marcus said, when I got your summons I thought this would be a brief visit. Receive formal thanks, maybe get a medal, return to my regular life. And now? Seraphine asked. Marcus thought about Epsilon Reach, about the hundreds of thousands of people who would live because a queen had learned compassion from a combat medic, because that medic had chosen kindness over convenience 12 years ago in a collapsed building. Now I think I'm exactly where I need to be, Marcus said. Seraphine's hand found his, fingers interlacing. The debt I owed you can never truly be repaid. But perhaps we can pay it forward together. One crisis at a time. One life saved at a time. Until compassion becomes ordinary rather than exceptional. That's the most ambitious goal I've ever heard, Marcus said. I learned from the best, Seraphine replied. They boarded the command frigate as twin suns set over Zenera Prime, casting the crystalline city in shades of gold and violet. The ship lifted smoothly, climbing through atmosphere toward the stars where Epsilon Reach waited, where 50,000 infected people needed help, where the largest joint humanitarian operation in history would succeed or fail based on choices made in the next few days. Marcus looked at Seraphine in the command center, surrounded by holographic displays and communication feeds, directing resources with the same intensity she'd once brought to revolution. He saw both the dying soldier he'd saved and the queen she'd become, and understood that sometimes one small act of kindness could ripple across decades and change civilizations. As they entered hyperspace, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of hope. Not hope that everything would be easy, or that they'd save everyone, or that suffering would end. But hope that compassion could bridge any divide, that shared purpose could unite any species, that one person choosing kindness could inspire an empire to do the same. The stars stretched into ribbons of light around them, and somewhere ahead, Epsilon Reach waited. Marcus pulled up medical deployment schedules, began coordinating with volunteer doctors, started planning quarantine zones and supply distribution networks. Beside him, Seraphine did the same, their shoulders touching as they worked, human and Zenari united by a simple truth learned 12 years ago in a collapsed building on a forgotten mining colony. When someone's suffering and you can help, you help. Everything else is just excuses. And together they would make sure the universe had one less excuse for letting people die.